too much of a distance that he has to cover from her own tribal language to the state language, to Hindi, to the market language, and then to English, which is a very foreign language. So how much do you load a child?
Hi, my name is Pranav Kothari. I work at Educational Initiatives and look after the work that EI does in assessments and personalized learning for low-income children. I have the great honor of introducing Sourav today on the show. I have really, was very mystified by this person who's constantly re-engineered. Started by working in the government space, worked at USAID as in the donor space, moved on towards an implementing side at Room to Read, an international organization, and being the India country head for them. I'm very curious to learn about the focus on, what languages should children be learning when they're starting school? How does technology shape up the growth and the scale that the organization might want to achieve, especially when it's increasing the amount of partnership that it's doing with the government. Thank you so much, Sourav, for joining us.
Thank you.
I look forward to having a fantastic conversation with you.
Thank you so much.
You spent almost 20 years working in this sector as a donor, as someone within the government, as someone working with the government, part of national agencies, international agencies. Can you, give us a bird's eye view of, how has this sector evolved over the last 2 decades?
Well, that's kind of interesting question, because you're right that it's been about 25 years, and I've seen it from all those angles of a donor, of an implementer, of the government. If you look at evolution, I would say that if I try to look at the last 25 years that I've been working in this sector, it's sometimes it feels like it's a case of 1 step forward, 2 steps backwards. So, there have been a lot of initiatives taken either by government or by NGOs, which are individually, they have been very brilliant initiatives. But somehow they have worked at cross purposes. So you'll have cases of governments coming and kind of reversing this programs done by other governments, or NGOs working at cross purposes. So if you look at the overall landscape, except for the access part, which definitely has improved. There's much more children now in school and first generation learners in schools. But on the quality side, that debate still is unresolved. I remember the kind of issues that we used to discuss in 94, 95 when DPP was launched is almost similar to the issues that we talk about even today, basic quality issues, equity issues. So somewhere I think we have not really made a lot of headway on that. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One, of course, is I guess this whole thing about the education governance. I think that's been a big draw, I would say, a challenge. And the kind of reform that you would have expected in education governance over the years, that has not happened. And the political influence in this whole governance system of education is pretty strong. It starts from hiring of people, postings of the kind of curriculum you have, the kind of training programs that you do, the way you do training programs. So all of that somehow has not happened. And probably, I think, as I reflect back, I think a lot of it probably would have to do with the whole issue about the political will to really make a change. And I don't see that really in the last 20 years.
Wow.
There has been several governments, but the whole issue of politicians wanting to have a strong education system, whatever party it may be, that somehow is missing. And the kind of debate that you would expect within political circles on education, that probably doesn't happen. So education reform has largely been led by the bureaucracy, which I think has its limited reach. Unless there's a political ownership of the whole thing, it probably won't reach that level. So I mean, things like so this whole push now for skill development, which I mean, it's no doubt important thing. Skill development and the lack of skills is something which is critical, and people are working on it. But the political push that you see for skill development, nobody is ever questioning the fact that why are you doing skill development? It's basically, essentially, you are doing certain things in addition. Ideally, your education system should have produced these skills. Your education system has not been doing that, and then you invest in additionally to build those skills. So instead of investing so much on skill development, why not invest that money on fixing the education system? So these kind of political discussions, I think these are more political discussions, and they don't happen. As a result, this whole education governance has not really improved over time.
So that's probably because the young adults today who don't have jobs are in some ways more the audience that the political parties want to focus on, right? So is it because of that skilling is getting more attention?
It is. I mean, it is. It's so. I mean, that's what I'm saying. The political parties, political leaders, they're thinking of the short term.
Yeah.
So because those are like, you can kind of immediately see the benefits of those interventions, and therefore focus on those interventions which give you quick benefits. The whole thing about education being a long-term thing, and I think somehow politicians have not got the thing that if you can really create a strong education system, it's a huge political legacy one can build. But somehow nobody is thinking that long-term. Everybody is thinking short-term, and therefore do things which are very short term, which can give you benefits immediately and show people that you've done something. The longer term effect of that is not being taken care of, and as a result, the larger systemic changes that you require somehow doesn't happen.
How does Room to Read operate? I mean, what is the theory of change? What is the organization currently doing to improve children's ability to read? So
I guess the theory of change at a basic level is very simple. It's like we believe it stems from the belief that world change starts with educated children. And so education, we think, solves a lot of the problems that the world is facing, including poverty, equity, conflict, and others. So the need for education is paramount. The earlier you start education, the better. Illiteracy is a big barrier. And so our focus has been to make children literate in the first place, which is the foundational learning is what you call it. At the same time, we realize that illiteracy and poverty is again quite related. So illiteracy leads to an intergenerational cycle of poverty. So we feel that investing in girls' education is therefore very important, because then if you can actually educate the girl, you can start breaking the cycle of poverty. So we have determined that we would focus on illiteracy and girls' education. So the idea is you have more children who are literate, you have more girls who are educated, and therefore these together forms empowered citizens, which lead to change. So that's the broad theory of change.
Given that Room to Read is an international organization with many different countries, operations, many different countries where you're doing the fundraising, how does India fit into that strategy? I mean, how is Room to Read India operating within a larger umbrella organization?
So Room to Read as an organization, again, we are now in about 14 countries. Now, and since we are an organization who are focused on two particular areas of education, which is girls' education and early grade literacy, it makes us easier that way, because the larger mandate is the same across all the countries, that we are going to work only in these two areas. We are not really diverting and going anywhere the fund is that way. So we have always been focused on these two areas. So there's a larger, what would I say, a program design which is followed across all the countries. Okay. So how you would deal with students, how we will train teachers on early grade reading, or what kind of inputs you will give to girls in a girls' education program is constant across all the countries. What varies is the local context. Obviously, the girls in India would have a separate set of challenges as compared to, say, Vietnam. Right. So you'll have to kind of contextualize your program, country specific. So and that is allowed. So that's so every country within the larger umbrella takes the global program design and then contextualizes it to the country context. Like India, for example, in literacy, has a huge issue about home language, school language things, which may not be there in many other countries. So this whole challenge of transitioning a child. So the issue is not really training a child in his first language, it's actually second language, because the first language is always different from the school language. So that transition thing.
So for example, you're talking about a child who is of Bengali heritage, is speaking Bengali at home,
right?
But happens to be living in Delhi and has to go to a Hindi medium school. Is that the example you're talking about?
There are actually varieties of these things. I mean, India is naturally multilingual, I would say. So there would be cases like, say, for example, if I take example of, say, Jodhpur in Rajasthan, the school language is Hindi. That's the state language of Rajasthan. But children there invariably would speak Marwari. And Marwari and Hindi are not entirely the same. So there's a transition that a child has to do from Marwari to Hindi. If you go to even the southern part, southwestern part, where you have the tribal areas of like Sirohi, there the child speaks a very different language, which is a Garase language, which is a tribal language. The market language there is Marwari, and the school language there is Hindi. So the child has to be transitioned really from Garasia to Marwari to Hindi. And it's not that one language to another, it's always, and most often it's a question of the child already speaking all these three languages in various measures. So it's not that you are teaching her or an entirely new language. The language is there in the environment, but you just have to kind of teach them how to read and write that language. That's one level of complicacy. The other level is what you're talking about. So in urban areas like in Delhi and Bombay, you will find children coming from various parts of the country. So even someone coming from Tamil Nadu or from Karnataka or from West Bengal, and they all have to now learn Hindi or English. Or so that's the other level of complexity. So all these complexities are very unique to India, which you would probably not find except for the other countries that we work in. Only Laos has this kind of a complexity, but other countries are more or less monolingual. So again, the global design then has to be contextualized to take care of these kind of challenges.
So I'm really intrigued by this child, who is speaking Garase at home, market Marwadi, school Hindi, and then there is the whole allure of English.
Oh yes, I mean that's an additional complexity, which is also a foreign language, because at some level a Garasia or a Marwadi or Hindi or a Bengali or any Indian languages would still follow the Akshara script. So you have a certain science of how you kind of do the Akshara things of your vowels and consonants and stuff like that, where English is a very different ballgame altogether. So obviously that's a very different complexity. We have really not even gone to that extent. Like till now, all our programs have been in the local language. We have not tried English as a foreign language, and there's a lot of demand from most governments to try ask us to go into English. We ourselves are not very confident that we can handle English the way that we handle our local languages.
So how do you handle this tension? Because I hear you say on one hand there's demand for English, but on the pedagogical side it's the vernacular language. And so how do you
So pedagogically we all think that vernacular is where the child should start their education in. English you can always transition at a later date. If you know the basic science of learning a language, you can always have a new language later on. So we do argue that with various state governments on the need to push English to a later date and start with the home language or the school or a vernacular language. But again, I would say, as I was talking about in the beginning about the whole political consensus around English and not English. So there are market forces, there are political forces which do not always follow a sound pedagogical principle. So there's always this thing about English coming in. And so the best that we could do is what we have offered governments is that so we have a strong library component. So we said that we can supply you English books so that the child can at least get a bit accustomed to what English is. But it's probably too premature for us to start teaching English because that's a very different ballgame.
There are some countries like in Japan, right, where the Japanese language has enough economic opportunities
Right.
that you may never having to ever learn English,
Right.
right? But in a country like India, where the economic opportunities available
Right.
to only native language speakers, may not be
limited.
sufficient. It is limited.
Yeah.
So, in that scenario, does is India obligated to infuse English early into the curriculum, even if it doesn't make the right pedagogic sense?
I think it's difficult to shy away from English. At some point of time, you're right that market would demand that you have English. And the way globalization is happening, the kind of opportunities that you have globally, it makes sense for children to even go and learn English. What our concern is to start English at a very early age, because I think your first start of language reading, writing should always be at the language that one is comfortable with. That's one part of the thing. The second thing is I think we don't even have the right infrastructure for teaching English to a large extent. One, because reading, writing cannot happen unless you have simultaneously listening and speaking happening with it. These are all correlated. So if you have an environment where the child is not speaking English, the child is not listening to English, you suddenly start teaching him to read and write English. It's just not going to work. And then you have this whole thing of not adequate teachers, the teachers themselves are not going through it. So there's a lot of other things to be resolved before you even talk about English.
So that's about the illustrious past, Sourav. What's the future like? What is the 5-10-year dream? What are you looking forward to the most?
So I think what we're now focusing for. So it's been about 12 years that we have been working, more than 12 years we started in 2003, so it's about 15 years that we are working here. Till about 2012, I guess we were very closed, we are very inward looking. So we were trying to develop the model, both in terms of our girls' education program and literacy. So the model itself evolved over time. So we started off with a library program, then we brought in instruction, and we kind of changed our instruction design a couple of times to figure out what makes more sense. To the point now where we are pretty confident that we have a model that works. We have evaluated them and assessed them rigorously to say that the model works in any kind of situations. We have tried them in various situations and found that it's working. I think the way forward now is basically we also realize that this closed intervention in a few schools here and a few schools there, I mean even 100 schools or 500 schools doesn't really make any difference in the whole landscape of India where we're talking about 1 million schools. So I guess what we're going now, what we're trying to do is looking at scale. That's been a predominant discussion that we're having within the organization for the last 2-3 years. We have been looking at various researches around scale, what Brookings has done, what MSI has done, and we have tried to develop a kind of a model for scaling up. So which we call it the I do, you do, you do, we do model, which is basically first you demonstrate what is happening, you create the evidence, then you work with the government very closely to build up the institutional system to scale up things. And when you say build up institutional system, it would mean things like, say for example, in our case, in the literacy program, you work with the government to see that the instruction design is aligned to the curriculum. Or the training modules are one that goes into government training programs, or the materials are one that the government can actually replicate. So create those systems so that the government can replicate. And that's what you call the we do phase, where we and the government work together. Right. Before you let it off to the government to scale it themselves, which we call the you do phase, where we expect that our involvement will be only marginal to give the technical assistance, that's it. So this model, we have again started implementing that. So we have started with Chhattisgarh and Uttarakhand, 2 states where we have got pretty good success in a sense that in both the states where we moved from the I do model to a we do model, we have been able to kind of bring down the cost by 1/5, yet the impact remained the same. The impact was actually better in the we do model, which was counterintuitive, but when we kind of analyzed it, we figured out that it made sense, because what was happening in those districts where we were working with the government was there was a large ownership of the government to kind of take that forward. Unlike in the other cases where we do in 100 schools maybe, but there are 1,000 other schools where something else is happening, and so the teachers are confused and all of that. So I think that's where we want to go. So the we do thing is we are discussing with governments to kind of have this model applied to more and more districts before the government takes it out from this. So that's I guess the way forward. In the next 5 years, I think we see ourselves doing more of this collaborative programs with government across various states.
So would you say that when working with the government, one of the things you have seen is that when it's collaborative, when there's greater ownership, when it's sort of in some way census applying to all schools, it's not that your results are getting compromised. In fact, they have taken the best of what you have to offer, they've done an iteration on that and deployed something that is more relevant, more contextualized, more useful on the ground.
And it's interesting because what we have also done a bit of research on various scale-up pathways that have been tried in India, because unfortunately, if you look at the history of India, not many programs, NGO programs, have actually scaled up. And what we found was there are two kinds of scale-up pathways that we could figure out. One is where the NGO itself has expanded. So from 20 schools, we moved to 20,000 schools and then 2 lakh schools. We found that doesn't work because a non-profit by its very nature is not configured to kind of scale that way. So the moment you scale yourselves up, you lose the control that you have. You lose the intensity of the work. So that doesn't work. The other pathway of scale up has been where government would have taken your idea and just scaled it up. So that again has not worked because in most cases it's someone in the government, whether it's the minister or a secretary, who just liked your idea and said, we'll do it across the entire state. And it doesn't work that way because there's no ownership created at the teacher level. The teacher thinks it is for him, it's still a program coming from top, and there's no ownership there. So this We Do model helped in that way because we engaged with the government at various levels of the government during a longer period. So it was almost a period of 1 year of engagement where we were talking to diets, we were talking to SCRT, we were talking to the teachers, the messaging was designed properly. What is the message that the project director would give, or what is the message that a block officer would give and teacher would give. So all those things have to be kind of tied up really to see that the ownership and the messaging happens correctly. So what you want to do is you want the teacher to know that it is a government program. It's not a room to read program. Because the moment he sees it's a room to read program, he knows that 2 years down the line, room to read won't be there. So I have no real stake to follow what is being taught. So to make that a government program, you really have to build in all the government stakeholders into that process. And that process takes long. But once you have that, then the results are assured.
You mentioned about how the government should listen, but listen to the right people and the right organizations, right? How does one determine as to what is genuine, what is fly-by-night, what has depth, what is based on research, and what just looks snazzy? I mean, if you were in the government's shoes, how would you decide and what advice would you give them?
I mean, I understand it's difficult, but I guess that you need to kind of set up certain systems. So one thing is, of course, measurement. So every organization who is implementing a program, what are they measuring and what are they showing as the outcomes? That's very critical. And outcomes, I would say, at the child level, not really at the... So there would be organizations, and there was a time when a lot of organizations were doing only teacher training, a lot of teacher training happening, but then ultimately when the teacher goes back to the school, it's a very different challenge that they face. So actually looking at those, the contribution of each of the organizations, and I think every organization has its own strong points. So you cannot work with one organization and expect that organization to advise you on everything. So, and I think that's kind of understood that every organization has its strengths. So, you select organizations based on their strengths and ask them to contribute that portion of that.
You mentioned that student learning outcomes are important, right? But the general belief is that unless teachers are trained, how would that trickle down into student learning outcomes? But you said there's an issue that teachers face when they go back. So if you could explain.
So I think the biggest problem with the teacher training, and teacher training is a double-edged sword. So if you have teacher training, teacher not trained, then that's a problem. If you have teachers going for training all the time, that's also a problem. So I think what has not happened really, and this is across the states if you see, and across policies, across things, we have not emphasized enough on the pre-service teacher training. Ideally, that should have been your focus because that's where the teachers are getting trained. Again, similar to the skill thing that I talked about. You're taking teachers to a system which is defunct. Then you place them on the schools. Then you additionally invest on them to build their skills, which makes no sense. I mean, you should rather invest at the time when the teachers are being trained. So adequate emphasis on pre-service teacher training is something which has not happened. Once the teacher is in the school, I think the focus should be more on providing the teacher on-site academic support rather than a lot of classroom-based training, which doesn't work because the challenges in every school is very, very different.
Sarva, I hear you clearly on the need for higher quality of pre-service training, the need for teachers to practice in the classroom and get feedback on the practices. Yeah. But this itself requires a higher degree of capacity of the right set of trainers, of the right set of educators for the educators. Where will this capacity come from?
Well, you have to kind of develop that, definitely. Like, so for example, for in-service, coaching is a very high set of skills. I mean, you can't expect the current set of people that we see in the system to be really good coaches. Many times it's not possible. So obviously you have to work towards those very systematically. That's one part of it. But the second part is many times it's not always a capacity issue. It's again boils down to a larger governance issue. So the point is, if you have BRCs and CRCs, I'm taking those as examples, they were cadres created to provide academic support. But then you created such a system that all that they were left doing was collect data. And they became in some way, bosses to the teachers, and they would not really do the things that was expected of them. But why is that happening? Because your education governance was weak. You didn't have the accountability systems which you would have required from them to happen. So it's not only the capacity is an issue, I agree, but then also to create those right kind of accountability structures which should demand accountability even for a teacher education institution. If they are training teachers, there has to be some way of measuring what they're training. I mean, is the teacher gaining any knowledge at the end of the course? We currently don't have those kind of systems. How are you changing teachers' attitudes? How are you changing their practices? To go and see whether what you've taught in the teacher, is she applying that in the field? So we just don't have those systems in place to kind of build on those accountability on the whole teacher.
But sort of how will this accountability come through, right? I mean, we talked about the political will. Even when the government tried to sort of measure the impact of the teacher training institutes, the pre-service, there was this big uprising, there was this big pushback from the owners of the teacher training institutes, right? So, I mean, is all hope lost? I mean, are we going to get anywhere then?
So, I guess, I don't think hope is lost. I mean, you have to keep trying, I guess. As I said, I mean, at one level, you might hope that the political system comes up and they kind of start demanding some of these things, which I strongly believe is one of the things that has still now been lacking. And this can make a difference if the politicians come up and start demanding these kind of accountability. The other thing is, of course, on how you design many of these programs. So say for example, when you are doing a large-scale teacher training, can you use technology for that matter? Many concepts are much easier explained in a technological mode than doing a face-to-face teacher training, where you waste a lot of resources to bring the teacher out of the school, set him in a center for 5 days and bore him to death, and yet doesn't understand anything. So also innovative ways of how to kind of deliver content to the teachers is one way of kind of easing out some of the challenges. I would still say the challenges would remain in terms of the larger governance issues and accountability issues, but at least you can have a way of delivering the content to the best possible manner.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing some pearls of wisdom. Really enjoyed our conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Sourav. It's a pleasure.
Yes, likewise.